Kapre. Among the many legends in the Philippines, there's one about a tall, slender tree demon called the Kapre. I learned about this one from my grandmother many years ago when I was growing up in a fairly rural area of the Philippines, a little town near Baguio City. She told me how they were these gigantic, bearded men who smoked tobacco and play pranks on people. Kapre also have this small white stone that could force them to fulfill any wish you desired. Being 5 years old at the time, I constantly thought about what I'd wish for if I could ever get my hands on that stone. Mostly candy or toys. Or even a bigger house for my family if I was trying to be a good boy. I thought about it in school, too. That's where this story takes place. The school I went to before we moved to the big city was a little 3-room building. 1 room for the younger kids, 1 room for the older kids, and 1 room for the staff room. It had a small clearing out front with a fairly large belit tree in the middle. There was a dirt path on the other side of the tree, and beyond the path was a dense forest. When school let out, we'd leave the building and run out into the clearing to play for a bit before heading down the path towards our homes. It was on one of these days during the heat of early summer that my best friend June and I found ourselves playing underneath the tree. We had picked up some sticks and were fighting imaginary monsters with our imaginary swords. The monsters were winning at first, but June and I soon managed to turn the tables in our favor until we collapsed at the foot of the tree, exhausted. The sun was beginning to set when we noticed the smell. Tobacco smoke. We didn't notice it at first because we were so wrapped up in our war with the monsters, but we should have noticed it immediately because of how out of place it was at the school. None of our teachers smoked. The only reason I recognized it as tobacco smoke was because my uncle smoked tobacco that smelled the exact same. I looked around to see if I could find him, but the field was empty. All the other kids had already gone home, and since the teachers usually went home first, we were the only 2 souls in the area. It didn't matter that much to us at the time, so we just kind of shrugged it off and went home since the sun was already heading closer to the horizon. Later at home that night, I remembered the description of the Kapre. June wasn't at school the next day. Sometimes kids stayed home to help their families with things, so it wasn't all that out of place. When school let out, I sat under the tree and watched some of the other kids play. June was more fun to play with than they were anyway. It was a really quiet and clear day. No clouds in the sky, no hint of wind. The only dust in the air came from the other kids kicking it up while they chased each other around. I caught a whiff of smoke in the air and realized that it still smelled like tobacco underneath the tree. Out of curiosity, I stood up and started to walk around the tree, all the while staring up into the branches. Nothing moved, no visible sign of smoke, and nothing that looked out of place. Somewhat disappointed, I sat back down and stared absently at the other kids and drew little stick figures in the dirt until I felt like heading home. As I stood up again to brush the back of my pants off to go home, I thought I heard the rustling of leaves above me. I quickly looked up, but there was nothing there. Just the same canopy of leaves and branches. It was getting a little late and my mom would be worried, so I just shrugged my shoulders and started down the path. About halfway to my house, I remembered there wasn't enough wind today to make the leaves rustle like that. About a week passed since June's disappearance. I asked the teacher about it, but she said she hadn't heard anything from his family. When I went by his house after school one day, the house seemed deserted. No lights on, no movement inside. He must have moved to a different city. I was heartbroken. June had been my best friend, and he hadn't even told me he was moving. It's a big thing for your best friend to just disappear without a word like that at such a young age. His family didn't even tell anyone that they were moving since my teacher had apparently not heard anything about it. That was probably the oddest part of the whole thing. Most of the time families moving up and out of our little town was a big deal, but no one seemed to have heard anything or even really noticed except for me. The more I thought about June's disappearance, the more convinced I was that a copper was in the tree in front of our school. The tobacco smell was there every day since June, and I first noticed it. I scrutinized every inch of that tree before going home for a whole week before I gave up for a bit. It wasn't until one day at my house when I heard my uncle talking about some good tobacco he'd brought home from the city that I had an idea. That night after my family had gone to sleep, I crept quietly from my siblings and my room to the living room where my uncle kept his tobacco in a nice little box. Not wanting it to be too obvious, I emptied some of the tobacco into a small bag and put the box back where I'd found it. Then I slipped outside and headed towards the school. It was a quiet night. I had never been outside so late at night before, and everything looked so different. Trees grew taller. Shadows were more menacing. The crunch of my feet on the dirt seemed to echo for hours as I tried to quietly walk down the path. Every time I heard a sound in the forest to my left, I was convinced that it was the copper out there, following me. I had always thought of them like a sort of benevolent genie who would grant wishes, but out here where the only light came from the moon and the stars, I began to doubt that. After walking what seemed like the longest hike I'd ever made, the schoolyard and the tree came into view. The schoolhouse itself was dark and empty. Nothing moved. I crept up to the belit tree where I had last played with June a couple weeks ago. I could still smell the tobacco as I looked up into the branches. It smelled a little different tonight. The light from the stars above seemed to puncture through the leaves of the tree, making themselves visible as I craned my neck back to look straight up to the top of the tree. One star in particular was much brighter and redder than the others. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the bag of tobacco that I'd stolen from my uncle and gingerly put it at the base of the tree. Not sure what else to do or say, I just stared at the bag for a bit in silence. I don't know what I was expecting to happen, and right at that moment I felt really stupid. My uncle would definitely notice that half of his tobacco was missing. I'm sure one of my older brothers was awake when I snuck out of the house, and he'd probably tell on me. They'd put two and two together and think that not only had I stolen some of my uncle's tobacco, but that I was smoking it, too. I'm not sure why I turned around and started to walk off then, knowing how much trouble I was likely facing tomorrow after school. I hadn't moved but 10 steps away from the tree before I froze. The leaves had rustled behind me. My heart throbbed in my ears so loudly that I'm still not sure whether I heard what followed next or not. I think I heard the sound of a plastic bag rustling. I think I heard branches creaking and leaves rustling again. But I can't be sure of any of that. What I do know is that as I looked down at my feet unable to move, a rounded white rock about the size of a quail egg rolled up from behind me and stopped in front of my feet. The whole world seemed to go quiet as I was compelled to reach down and pick the stone up, as if my will had nothing to do with my actions anymore. I held the stone cupped in both my hands. It weighed much more than it looked like it should. Everything around me had stopped moving and I couldn't even hear my heart pounding in my ears anymore. There was nothing except for me and the stone I held in my hands. I can't tell you how long I stood there staring at the stone, but I remember feeling a sense of urgency return after some time. "I want June back," I whispered. All at once, everything started moving again. My heart leapt back into my ears. A sudden gust of wind nearly bowled me over, setting me back in motion. The stone fell from my hands, but I kept moving away from the tree, my feet carrying me ever swiftly down the road. I felt raindrops on my face as I ran, felt a crack of thunder ripple through my body as the sky lit up behind me. I can't say that I was very quiet when I finally made it back to my house, but it didn't matter too much. The storm covered any loud noises I made getting back into my bed. I didn't sleep that night, but I don't really think anyone else did when the storm came through. The storm was one of the biggest that I can remember, though we didn't live there for very long. Luckily, there didn't seem to be any real damage to any of the houses in town except for one. June's old house had been destroyed by a sudden deluge of water that came down from the hill behind it. Not much was left other than the floorboards and some parts of the fence. School wasn't cancelled that day. The weather was actually quite clear, and there weren't even any clouds left in the sky. Since there wasn't much to clean up in town, most of us kids still showed up for class. When I got to school that day, the tree was on its side, completely uprooted. The lightning from last night must have blown it clear out of the ground. The other kids were around the hole it had left, pointing and chattering amongst themselves. That doesn't look like a root. Some roots are white, stupid. They don't get sun to tan them brown. I felt some rain fall from the sky, even though the weather was so clear. I glanced up to find the clouds but didn't see any as I walked up slowly to the edge of the hole and looked down. I could see 3 or 4 white roots at the bottom of the hole. Confused, I looked at the bottom of the tree and could see that most of the roots were shades of brown, none of them were as ashen gray as what was in the hole. Without a word I slid down to the bottom, my feet and hands getting caked with mud. I made my way towards one of the roots and reached down to tug at it. The root was soft as I grasped it with both hands and pulled. It was held pretty firmly in the ground by the mud, so I had to tug really hard until it came out of the ground with a satisfying sucking noise. I wasn't ready for it to come out so fast and I fell backwards onto my rear, wincing. Then I heard a scream. It was one of the younger girls. More screams followed her as I opened my eyes to look at what I had just pulled out of the ground. It wasn't a root, it was an arm. I scooted back away from it in horror, my back against the dirt in the side of the hole. I felt something firm pushing against my back that didn't feel like mud. Slowly, I turned around and saw his face. June's head was in the side of the mud hole. I had uncovered it slightly when I slid down into the hole to see what was down there. I never did find out why June had been buried under the belit tree like that. My family moved away from that small village shortly after the incident. I tried talking about it with my family a number of times. My uncle's face would darken and he'd just ignore me. The rest of my family would distract me with pulverine, a Filipino candy that is like a bunch of sweet powder which if you eat a lot, you won't really be able to talk much. It worked, because soon enough I stopped asking questions and eventually moved on.